Hello and welcome to Frontlines of Social Good, the news and views program from the Philanthropy Mastermind series. I'm your host, Jay Frost. Today's focus is on war, or more specifically, the impact of recent U.S. military engagements around the world and their impact on nonprofits, philanthropy, and the communities that they serve. We'll hear from two leading voices on the front lines of this work. First, we'll speak with Ashleigh Subramanian-Montgomery, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Charity and Security Network, a leading resource and advocacy organization that works to protect the ability of nonprofits to deliver aid, support human rights, and operate effectively in areas affected by disaster and armed conflict. Then we talk with Patricia McIlreavy, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, which helps individual and institutional donors increase the effectiveness of their philanthropic response to disasters and humanitarian crises. Later in the program, we'll shift from crisis to opportunity with Steve MacLaughlin, who joins us to discuss his new book, How to Raise Money, a classic guide for the modern fundraiser, and what enduring fundraising principles matter most in times like these. But first, let's take a look at some of the largest philanthropic gifts announced since our last episode 2 weeks ago and the top news impacting the nonprofit sector today. We'll go as we always do with the top 5 gifts that we've identified, starting in reverse order with a tie at number 5. Linda Carter, a name that many of you might recognize from her Wonder Woman days, has made a $10 million gift to MedStar Georgetown University Hospital to establish a surgical training center in honor of her late husband, supporting the next generation of surgeons. And also, at number 5, this week, Providence Mission Hospital has received a $10 million gift from Kathy Williams to support a new health center in Rancho Mission Viejo, expanding access to care in a rapidly growing region of Orange County. Number 4, the Ballmer Group has awarded a $48 million grant to California State University, Los Angeles, to expand youth mental health services across Los Angeles County. At number 3, an anonymous donor has made a $50 million gift to the University of Chicago to advance research and support faculty work in artificial intelligence. Number 2, the Granger family has made a $75 million gift to Mayo Clinic to transform healthcare logistics and improve patient care delivery systems. And topping the list this week at number 1, the Stephens Greth Foundation has made a $100 million gift to Children's Health and UT Southwestern to support a new pediatric campus in Dallas. Have we missed a gift? I'm certain that we have. Let us know or issue any corrections to us. You can reach me directly through the link you see in the chat. Top sector news this week. According to the National Council of Nonprofits and their partner organizations, more than 1,300 nonprofits and over 20,000 public commenters have opposed proposed federal changes that would impose new certification requirements on organizations receiving government funding. As outlined in a public update from the National Council of Nonprofits President and CEO Diane Yentl, the proposal would require grantees to certify compliance under potential civil and criminal penalties with policies related to diversity, immigration status, and counterterrorism measures. Sector leaders argue that these requirements could create legal and operational challenges for nonprofits, particularly those working with vulnerable populations or in complex policy environments. In another story, according to the Nonprofit Times, a federal judge has dismissed a proposed settlement that would have weakened enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, the provision of the U.S. tax code in place since 1954 that bars 501c3 organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. The case was brought by a group of religious broadcasters and churches seeking to allow certain political speech without risking tax-exempt status. In a decision issued at the end of March, the court rejected the proposed settlement on procedural grounds, leaving the Johnson Amendment unchanged. However, the Nonprofit Times notes that the ruling does not resolve the broader legal questions surrounding the law, meaning similar challenges could emerge in the future. Research from Canada and ABFE finds that Black-led nonprofits continue to receive smaller grants and less unrestricted funding than white-led organizations, despite high-profile commitments made following the racial justice protests of 2020. As reported by the Associated Press, the research shows that many of those commitments were short-term and have not been sustained, with funding levels declining in subsequent years. Also, Black-led organizations are more likely to receive restricted program-specific funding rather than general operating support, limiting their ability to invest in long-term capacity. According to reporting from Marketplace this week, humanitarian organizations such as Save the Children are facing increasing operational challenges as armed conflicts disrupt their work. They report that aid delivery can be slowed or complicated by sanctions, compliance requirements, banking restrictions, and security concerns, making it increasingly difficult to move funds and supplies into conflict-affected areas. In some cases, organizations must navigate multiple layers of approval to transfer resources, while shifting conditions on the ground can limit access to communities in need. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., local reporting shows how the effects of global conflict are playing out in real time at the community level. In D.C., Fox 5 reports that Americans have been evacuating the Middle East amid escalating violence, families navigating sudden displacement, disrupted travel, and the logistics of getting home safely, often with support from nonprofits and other community networks. And in Wisconsin, WMTV reports on nonprofit-led activities marking the war in Ukraine, now in its fourth year, with organizations mobilizing public support, raising funds, and sustaining attention on a conflict that, for many, has moved out of the headlines. To explore how these dynamics are affecting nonprofit work in real time, I'm joined now by Ashleigh Subramanian-Montgomery, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Charity and Security Network. Ashleigh's work focuses, among other things, on how counterterrorism laws and policies affect nonprofits' ability to operate, especially in conflict-affected regions. She's worked across countries including Botswana, Burundi, Nigeria, and Palestine, and on issues spanning Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, and Syria. Welcome, Ashleigh. It's great to see you. Maybe I can start with just this kind of broad question, which is how, in your view, do war, sanctions, and counterterrorism rules make it harder for nonprofits to move money and deliver aid safely?
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate the question, and thank you so much for having me today. It's great to be here with you and to have this conversation. So maybe I'll take this question in three parts. As you noted, thinking through war first and sanctions, then counterterrorism measures. So thinking about how war impacts the ability to move money and deliver aid and partner safely, I think the first thing it's important to note is that as soon as a country is in war or is considered a war zone, it automatically de facto becomes then considered a high-risk jurisdiction. And banks are historically risk-averse actors and really get hesitant to make transfers, even humanitarian transfers that would support communities in need in any jurisdiction that's considered high risk. So what we see from banks is that they'll start pulling back. They might delay the amount of time that a transaction is able to get through, or they might completely deny transactions or access to services for humanitarian organizations completely, a practice that's known as de-risking. And this is largely due to banks being worried about counter-terrorist financing risks or taking a risk-averse approach versus assessing the actual risk and then going from there. So what this results in is that a lot of times communities most in need won't get the humanitarian aid that they need in time because of the back and forth between banks and banks pulling out and not supporting humanitarian organizations. For humanitarian organizations, war makes it really hard to get basic access to communities. So humanitarian orgs are often spending a lot of time negotiating access in war zones, and every second that's spent negotiating this access and trying to be able to be granted this by authorities or warring parties means that it's seconds that aid isn't being delivered. And sadly, in a war context, this can quite literally be the difference between life and death. So there's, I think, a multitude of factors. Another thing we see is if there, a lot of times in conflict or war contexts, we see governing authorities putting more restrictions on NPOs. We see this in the context of Israel being able to restrict access to NPOs trying to get aid into Gaza. And when these restrictions happen, then you have less providers, humanitarian providers, who are able to then deliver aid and access, and again, more time and bureaucratic processes to navigate to be able to get aid through. So it can be a real multi-factor approach of how war can impact the delivery of aid or money. Um,
It sounds like there would be a cascading effect as well. That if you have one entity or one government taking a certain approach to a conflict, perhaps one in which they're engaged or where a partner is engaged, that others who are observing this are going to become more careful about how they're engaged as well, either for legal reasons or maybe just policy reasons or even perception.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It does have a cascading effect. Banks talk to each other, donor communities talk to each other. So if you see one donor starting to pull back, especially if it's a bigger donor, one that's more well known, then you might see other donors start to do the same because they're worried about the repercussions of potentially delivering aid in conflict and what that could mean for them with a host of counterterrorism or counterterrorist financing measures that they have to abide by.
Are you seeing more of this happening now? I mean, is this a rising trend? Because I know there are. I think the statistics I saw from ICRC at the beginning of the year was that there are more conflicts raging right now around the world, about 130 at that time, in 60 countries than there have been at any point since the Second World War. But I also know that that's a definitional matter about what constitutes a conflict or a war. But moving beyond that, are you seeing that the impact on nonprofits and the funding to nonprofits is under increased pressure?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen that particularly over the past year and a half, certainly in the U.S. context with the Trump administration, both kind of taking a wrecking ball to being pulling out of international organizations, but also the direct targeting on nonprofits and attacking them through legislative actions, executive orders. This has made donors in particular very hesitant. There's still some brave leading donors that kind of refuse to pull back, but we do see this preemptive compliance from donors where they're pulling back funding for organizations, and then nonprofits are having a harder time with their ability to operate, keep their lights on, keep functioning. There's also, I think nonprofits have been for many years very, very good and stringent about having sophisticated self-regulatory measures in place, like due diligence measures, risk mitigation measures, because nonprofits more than anyone want aid to end up in the hands of where it's supposed to end up, want money to end up where it's supposed to end up. But we've seen a real increase over the past year of compliance costs related to ensuring that these measures are even more stringent and that they can be communicated to a bank or to a donor. So there's a lot of now time that nonprofits are spending navigating this versus carrying out their mandates and missions and really doing their life-saving work. And maybe if I can tie sanctions and CT into
Please.
this. So I think sanctions have been communicated in particular by sanctions implementers, so governments that develop sanctions packages and implement sanctions like the US government, like a lot of Western governments. The way that they have been packaged and the narrative around them is that they're a humane alternative to war. But this is a narrative that I think really, really needs to change because there's a lot of data and evidence and research that shows that they're not a humane alternative. They're actually economic warfare, so just warfare by another means. There was a
Could you
really great,
provide a practical example of that just
yeah,
to illustrate that for the audience?
yeah. So there's a great study that came out that showed that it was an analysis of data from 152 countries over a 10-year period. And what it showed was that there's 564,000 deaths annually from sanctions, and this is equivalent to the amount of deaths that we see annually in war. So it's not a humane alternative to war. Sanctions are causing the same number of deaths as war. year in and year out. So policymakers try to paint a different picture in how they present them and in them in the U.S. context, often being packaged as a tool of first resort. But I think it's a narrative that we really need to change and really need to show that this isn't the actual case. And we see this. There's lots of examples of this: Cuba, Venezuela, Iran. Sadly, we're now seeing being both a sanctions and war and invasion happening. So now it's two-pronged, but sanctions for a long time in Iran, North Korea, Syria. We saw it for a long time, but now thankfully those have been almost wholesale lifted in a way that you don't often see.
It sounds like by implication that there are other tools at the disposal of all the actors in this space, whether it's governments, companies, foundations, nonprofits, so that they can exert pressure on behalf of their principles. So to make that as benign as possible, if the idea of a major NGO is to provide food to a community that's in need of food, that there might be other ways to do it besides military or sanctions. What are some of the things that you hear people talking about as alternative methods of trying to make good in the world when there are barriers to doing that, either because of the local or the national or regional governments?
Yeah, I think this is a great question and a really important one to be thinking through. So I think this is where peace building really comes into play, and there are a number of great peace building organizations who their kind of sole focus is how do we get communities everything they need from a humanitarian perspective. But I think why peace building is so important is that it focuses on what is the fundamental root cause if there's a conflict in our country, either internally or externally or both. How do we solve that? First, from how do we put down the weapons and the guns and basic safety for everyone, but then how do we address the drivers of conflict? So if there's economic consequences, if there's grievances, if there's long-standing things within a community that are causing conflict, how do we address those so that long-term humanitarian aid essentially becomes obsolete? We don't need it because our country is able to be so economically stable, politically stable, communally stable, have those solid relationships. I think and really want to give credit here to local nonprofits, local civil society actors, because I think they really, there's a lot of INGOs that do great work on peace building, and we work with a lot of them. But really, it's the local actors who are at the forefront and on the front lines of leading these efforts and really bringing not just their local communities, but they're able to expand that then to their entire nation, domestically, and then also regionally and beyond. And especially here, I would highlight women peace builders are particularly really, really good at this.
And they are global, as you just said. International NGOs or INGOs are one place to look for those kinds of organizations. I know that in the past we might have looked at the listing generated by the UN to find those major NGOs or INGOs that are around the world. Is that still the case, or has that network grown? Are there different ways that they kind of share information, and it's possible also for those of us outside that world to see them and to observe their work and to support their work?
Yeah, I think that where INGOs can be really, really beneficial is that they often have networks of local peace builders and local communities that they work with, so they can kind of bridge that gap and build that policy to practice pipeline, which is so important, and hopefully be bringing in local civil society actors to spaces like the UN Security Council, other places of power where their voices can be heard, their recommendations can be hopefully taken seriously, and real change can start to happen. But also to note that they're making real change day in and day out in their contexts.
Right. It's not always celebrated either. Well, that leads me to the other thing I wanted to ask you about, which would be those local civil society groups, or those CSOs, NGOs. They're going by different names, and they also perform different functions,
Right.
but external to government, often voluntary organizations. So what happens to those folks when governments tighten the security rules in the name of war? What happens to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a sad reality. I think there's a host of negative repercussions that happen to them. So I'll walk through a few of them. Maybe if I can start when governments tighten counterterrorism and counter-terrorist financing rules and regulations. So here, I think we can think about foreign terrorist organization or FTO designations. The U.S. has really proliferated these over the past year. And they're now conflating them where they were traditionally in the counterterrorism space. We're now seeing them conflated in the counter narcotics and organized crime space, especially through in Haiti, Mexico, Venezuela. So what happens to civil society groups is that it makes it incredibly hard for them to operate because legally, once an organization or entity is designated as an FTO, almost all engagement with that entity is prohibited by the U.S. material support statutes. So if you think about Mexico, for instance, where the cartels are designated now as an FTO, the cartels literally operate in every part of the country. So for an NPO to maybe just go and do their basic work, if they have to pay a toll to an NPO, to an FTO or to a cartel, if routine engagement, their routine activities it means engagement with a cartel, now they could be at risk for terrorist financing if they have to pay a toll, for instance, just to get from point A to point B. So it really restricts access to movement, access to services, and potential legal and criminal liability for NPOs. So that's one thing. And then another thing to note is that for local civil society groups, especially under countering the financing of terrorism measures, we see those become most restrictive for local civil society groups who are already under-resourced. So a lot of times this might be a women's rights organization or a similar type of organization that may not have the support of the government as things stand, even in the best of times. So then these CFT measures will make it really restrictive for them to receive funding from donors, will make which will then shrink their already really under-resourced budgets, might make them face attacks from the government at higher rates and make them more targeted. So their ability to kind of wholesale function and operate will become more and more limited, and their operational ability, there's not a conducive operating environment for them to continue working in.
Wow, it's there. There are so many challenges that nonprofits, under any designation already have. That having this kind of bunch of layers of determining whether or not they're at risk must really impede their ability not just to carry out the work to drive from one community to another to do something because they're worried about this, but even to know that they might be at risk under new and increasingly complicated sets of laws. So, what is the real advice to nonprofit leaders who are thinking about all these risks, both the ones that they know about and maybe the ones they don't know about, the knowns and the unknowns, to borrow a phrase in the past, without simply walking away from the need? How can they continue to do the work, even sometimes without knowing what the risks might be?
Yeah, another really, really important question. I mean, I think if I can make a recommendation, continue pushing policymakers, those with power, towards policy coherency across these different measures. So across, sanctions have their own law, counterterrorism measures have their own and their own penalties. Counterterrorist financing have their own, the US operating under strict liability. So if there was policy coherency across all of these different measures, material support, that would make it so that NPOs don't have to navigate each and every measure at each and every point. So pushing for policy coherency, I think, is something that we should all continue doing at all times, even if it seems like a distant future. We try to build that future now. And then I think in terms of thinking about risk, just continuing to Nonprofits, as I said, are very good about having due diligence, risk mitigation, all these measures in place to account for any potential external risks that could come. So continuing to have those in really strong ways and to be able to communicate those to banks, to donors externally, both at the beginning of a project or a new service relationship with the bank, and then communicating them often throughout. I think that's really important. I also think it's incumbent upon INGOs and bigger organizations in the nonprofit sector to be able to support smaller NPOs and less resourced NPOs and those who can't afford a general counsel or a compliance staff. Walk them through this, share what you know, connect them to resources, connect them to pro bono lawyers. Do everything we can as a sector to support one another, noting that, it's a great sector, but there's inequities within it as well. So do what we can to keep each other safe and support one another.
And it does sound like people can learn a lot of that by, of course, following the work there at the Charity and Security Network. So how can they learn more about the work and follow you and your colleagues and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So we are a resource center. So welcome everybody to check out our resources. We have resources on everything that I talked about today. So you can check out our website, and from there you can become a member of the Charity and Security Network. Our membership is absolutely free for everyone and every organization. And there you'll have access to even more resources, more webinars, different events that we host routinely. We can connect you. We always try to, if we don't have the resources externally, to make sure we get you to who might have the resources externally to make sure that pipeline's strong and we can get you what you need. And then we have a number of different working groups and task forces and coalitions that we either lead or are a part of that folks can reach out to us and plug into as well.
Thank you very much, Ashleigh, for all of this today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay.
Now, to take us from some of these discussions, where we talked a lot about policy, but maybe another angle, looking especially at the donors to all this activity, I'm joined now by Patricia McIlreavy, who is president and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. She leads one of the few organizations focused specifically on how philanthropic dollars move in crises, tracking where funding goes, where it doesn't, and how to make it more effective in complex emergencies, including conflict settings. So hopefully we have Patty with us. If you can come up on the stage, Patty, we'd love to see you. And it looks like maybe we've lost her for a moment, but I'm sure.
No, I'm here.
There we are. Hi, Patty.
How you doing?
We see you now. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
It's great to be here.
I do want to start with, again, kind of a broad question, which is, what does war do to the normal rules of disaster giving?
It's such an interesting question because I think complex humanitarian emergencies, of which war would be included within them, are not an area where philanthropy has traditionally been incredibly generous, and not because I think they're indifferent, but very much because they're uncertain. I mean, all the things that Ashleigh just outlined for us, there's a lot of barriers within that. Why should we give here? What should we do there? What are some of the ways we can run afoul of that? And those challenges create a lot of complexity. And actually, later this month, April 15th, CDP is going to be releasing research that we've done on why philanthropy gives or doesn't give in complex humanitarian emergencies, and how we can work differently with them in terms of that messaging and try and help advance that. I think one of the risks that you have within war, as within any disaster, is it's that hazard meeting of vulnerability. But what occurs within war, Jay, is you've just got so many layers of that vulnerability and those hazards that are just piling on top of each other. And that becomes very complex, again, for where to give, how to give. So you have food insecurity or displacement or underdevelopment, governance crises, all these various needs. And I think, where we do see a lot of traditional philanthropic giving is those early days after an event like a natural hazard, an earthquake or a hurricane. People can really get their head around, this happened and these are the needs, and these are why the needs are there. With a complex humanitarian emergency, with a war, it's continuing. The scale is constantly, moving. It's possibly getting larger. It's geographically changing. You have access issues, as Ashleigh noted, right? How do we get to the population? How does the population get access to services? You have an exacerbation of current crises, and you also have the creation of new crises. Right now, there's a lot of focus on the Middle East and Iran and Lebanon and what's occurring in those countries. But to be honest, what we at CDP are concerned about is what's going to happen in Sudan, what's going to happen in Myanmar, the ripple effects of this crisis. Of course, we feel very strongly for what's occurring in the Middle East, but we also want philanthropy and donors to remember that the interdependence of the global economy and also the cost of getting food to those areas, the straits and how they're utilized, all of that ripples onto the costs and complexities of the assistance that's being given right now. And that's something donors really need to keep in mind as they're working with their implementing partners that they engage with.
I'm trying to imagine, because donors, that's a word that encompasses a lot of different people and entities. Mm-hmm. And they, like nonprofits that we were talking about a moment ago with Ashleigh, also come to this with varied experience and knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So
I'm wondering if maybe one of the touchstones as they're figuring out what to do and how to do it is to even know if an area is in conflict. And that brings me to a really simplistic question, but I have to ask it. It's been in the news the last couple of days, which is whether something is a war or not, and whether or not that in fact matters in this discussion. So let me just ask you that. As you're thinking about these issues and talking with donors, as you do they ask that question? I mean, if there are 60 countries where there are 130 conflicts around the world, that's a lot of conflict, but it's not always considered a war. And you just mentioned a number of countries where the conflicts, some of which are new and some have been going on for quite a while.
Well, I mean, to be honest, war is the framing of geopolitics. So, for the donors, whether you're an individual donor, whether you're a corporate donor, whether you're a family foundation, whether you're a government looking to assist, you're going to have a different relationship with those geopolitics and what that means for you in terms of a declaration. And you mentioned earlier whether a country you're aware of or engaged with is a belligerent within that conflict and what it might mean to you. Of course, those are individual drivers as to why you may get involved. But from a humanitarian perspective, it's less what you call it. It's more, what does it mean for the people, right? So there are people being displaced in the hundreds of thousands right now. There are ships of food that are being transited through, around the Horn. There are so many, the Cape of Good Hope. There are so many changes that are occurring that at the end of the day, what we'll always say, it's a little bit about the ecosystem of, are you a humanitarian, or are you a peace builder, or are you doing recovery work, are you doing development? To the population in need, does it really matter? Those are terms we use for ourselves, for our own comfort, or for maybe our lens. If I'm working at Department of State, I very much care, or at the United Nations, what we call this conflict. But from the humanitarian perspective, from those of us who are trying to assist and get funding and support the needs on the ground, in many ways, there's an attentiveness to that. I mean, Ashleigh pointed out all the reasons why we have to be attentive to that. But I think it's also about, what is it that this community needs, and how do I help them get that? How do I support the assistance in getting into this area? And that's the challenge that we have in terms of, getting stuck on the terminology. And it's not, because of course I don't want to diminish the importance of that terminology. There's a lot of reasons why that terminology becomes important, especially related to protection work or the laws, the laws of war, et cetera. They're very important. But at whether we help or not as donors right now in this environment, I think is less determined by that versus other factors we may have in terms of how we interpret the needs on the ground, and where we may have our own value system or our own programmatic initiatives and where we wish to support.
Yes, thank you for that. That's music to my ears. I want to ask you about something a little bit different, which is when all these disasters, some of which are man-made and some of which have to do with belligerency, as you were saying, as they emerge, there's always a question about how philanthropy can be its best self. and when it's helpful and when it's not. And I know that's driven by different factors. I mean,
Right.
one of the donors themselves or entities that are specifically prescribed to give, but often it's also nonprofits, NGOs, et cetera, which are seeking support for their work in a given region. So where, especially as crises rise and emerge, where can nonprofits and where can philanthropy specifically be most helpful as opposed to potentially complicate a situation?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And I would say it's very rare that philanthropy gets in the way. So, first I would say, let's pull back from this idea that more money into these situations is a negative, because there's so rarely enough funds. There's so rarely sufficient amounts that are required. So I would say, lean into these situations to the comfort you're able to, or find organizations that, intermediaries, for example, who, if you hear from what, you just heard earlier about the sanctions and the restrictions and the access, and it all seems like too much, there are organizations like the Center for Disaster Philanthropy that are more than happy to help you get that money to that last mile, to support in that way. So I think one is we need to more money is required. The second thing, and there is enough money, right? We have this idea of donor fatigue. That's a terminology I really don't love, because is it really, fatigue for the situation or the appetite, or there's too many crises, or is it just we haven't given enough clarity of like direction? So, one is really sit back and say, where do I want to help, and then help in those places, right? And it's not about, choices. Yes, you may need to make some choices, but get comfortable with them and support in the places you can support. What we do also really recommend, and it came up earlier, is fund locally. Local solutions are in many places, be it a complex emergency or a response to a natural hazard, a disaster, they often have very strong ideas and solutions that we may not have thought of, not cookie cutter, really contextualized. Doesn't mean that the international organizations are in any way not to be supported, but go to your comfort level, get as far as you can, as close as you can to the populations in need. And also think about recovery. We've been trained for generations in this mindset of immediate relief. Here's, some plastic sheeting, here's a warm meal. But what communities really want, even in a conflict setting, is agency and dignity. They want us to have programming that allows them to have a certain amount of authority over the choices for their future, authority over what's occurring for their families. And so looking for partners that have that long arc, that idea of how do we help this community not be dependent on external assistance or charity, but rather, step up and lean into what they are doing for themselves, and seeing them and lifting that up. And that's very important. And I think, COVID gave us a real conversation starter on this. And we all know what it was like to lose that ability to know when something was going to be over. And so while a conflict is obviously, I don't mean to belittle the incredible fear of what's occurring in the conflict settings right now, it's a taste of it. It's a taste of not knowing what's coming. But also knowing that all of you, your communities, need something different to feel secure, to feel like you have agency over your choices. And so trying to fund those types of approaches, really putting money into those situations and trusting organizations, who are operational, who are on the ground, who are connected with that community to come to you with solutions and to say, these are the ways we want to move forward. This is the ways we want to approach this challenge right now in front of us. And so it's really about that. I think we need to look at how do we keep our attention on it, even when the media attention may fade, or when they're asking us to look at something else. And that's one of the challenges with conflict, with wars, is we get really focused on the war and we lose sight of the people who are affected by the war. And so that's, something to try and also keep in mind is it really, in many ways, you may still, you may support or not support this war at the moment. But that shouldn't change how you think about helping the people who are trapped within this war, from a humanitarian perspective, because we're looking at how do we help those who are affected by this conflict, and how do we better support them or those who've left the country, those who remain in the different countries. Those are one of the things as a humanitarian we would be challenging people to look at, is like, let's yes, these geopolitics are important, but how do we look at people who are affected and how do we try and help them?
Yeah, I appreciate all of that so much. And you did mention the importance of these local organizations or local actors. I guess sometimes they are independent organizations, sometimes they work with some of the larger charities.
Yes.
And of course, some of the largest NGOs have local staff. So there are lots of different ways that people do this and still tap into not just local knowledge, but where local entities have authority over projects because they know their own communities best.
Right.
But you also mentioned something else, which is this kind of way that people see a disaster, man-made or otherwise, and then they kind of move on to the next thing. Sometimes it's media treatment, sometimes it's just the nature of humans. But there are some conflicts that have been going on for a long time. Gaza, Ukraine are two examples. Afghanistan for many years. DRC is another example of this. There are many places around the world. And I'm wondering how, if this is not an issue of donor fatigue, because I agree with you there. I think that's just another way in terms that people throw around. How we can help donors to see that long-term investments in some of these things that seem to be at a distance protracted, that they really can have an impact, a positive impact on a community, and how they can do that through local organizations or local entities.
Well, I think a little bit of it, Jay, is about storytelling, right? We get so, the way we look at protracted crises is many ways. The way, again, we've looked at a lot of disaster response or recovery is it's these log frames and indicators and how much did you do in this? And that in a protracted crisis is very hard because there's no solution. There's no end date to that project. And so what we try and talk about with our donors is to say, you are not responsible for ending this conflict, for ending this need, for ending the suffering of this community. I think that's one, is just to remind ourselves, we only have so much responsibility and there's only so much we can do. So putting that in perspective really helps us also take away that weight of I'm responsible to somehow stay there forever until this is resolved. That's actually not a requirement. You may, but to remember, you support a school. I'm going to use a recovery timeline. So I'm going to say you support a school for 2 years. That is 2 years of education those children have received. That's 2 more years than they would have gotten if you hadn't given that support. If you support a health center, even if it's just with medicines or for 6 months, that's 6 months more, or that's that access to that medical than they wouldn't have gotten before. Malnutrition, fund a malnutrition center. Yes, that child may well be malnourished again in a few years. That's a regrettable reality of some of these situations. But you've allowed that child to survive through this current drought season. And so we are not able as individuals, as donors, to fix the governance crises or address systemic inequities or, all these things are much larger than us. We can speak out about them, we can be aware of them. But in that situation, if we really look at the person, if we think of proximity as humanity, then it's what can I do for them today? And will that make a difference to them tomorrow? And I'll have been part of that tomorrow. And that's enough. It's not as much as we'd all like. We'd love for it to be bigger than that, but we're part of a bigger tomorrow. Every one of our inputs, every one of our solutions in terms of supporting, community requests for assistance, we are partners with them in their tomorrow. And maybe that child at that school that you helped, or that child who's, fights off the malnutrition and survives, maybe they're the person who resolves. They're the leader for that country for the future. And then you've been part of that too. You'll never know, but that's okay. It's about being part of that. Maybe I am part of that bigger solution for that country because I have helped in a way I may never get credit for, but I know it had an impact on a life today. And that made their tomorrow possible.
That's a great example of storytelling right there that we can all learn from. Thank you for that. Patty, if people want to know more about the center and what it does, and feel free to give like a 30-second thumbnail sketch of that for people who are not familiar with your work, but how would people learn more and become more involved?
Yeah, so we're at disasterphilanthropy.org. We really seek to mobilize philanthropy towards equitable recovery after disaster. And we do that. And that's not, philanthropy is all of the ways you say it's individuals all the way through big organizations and foundations, and really trying to get, one is really just opening up our understanding of why, equitable recovery is important and what it means to have community-led solutions, and really just kind of understanding that, the hazard meeting that community vulnerability is what creates a disaster. Really trying to get people to understand that then feeds what a recovery looks like. We also look at how do we influence philanthropic capital flows, like where is money going and why is it going? So towards recovery or those connections. And then also just looking at how to help coordinate better. How do we, convene or coalesce around an idea and kind of model a behavior that will hopefully change others' thinking. So we do, we're on the website. We have, like I said, we have a upcoming. If you want to learn more about, complex humanitarian emergencies in more generic sense, we're going to be having a webinar April 15th, but we have a lot of those sessions. They're free to attend. We advertise them on our website. There's what we're watching. So we want to keep the track of what's going on in the world. So there's a lot of items on our web site. And I'll put my contact details in here for participants.
Thank you so much. And we'll make sure to put that in the show notes for those who watch later. Thank you so much, Patty, for sharing some of this today. Really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So if the earlier part of today's program has been about how conflict is reshaping the environment nonprofits operate in, the next question might be simply, what does it take to raise money in a moment like this, or for that matter, in times of relative peace as well? And for that perspective, I spoke with Steve MacLaughlin, longtime fundraising strategist and the author of a new book, his second book, How to Raise Money, a Classic Guide for the Modern Fundraiser. And here is that conversation. Steve, thank you so much for being here on Frontlines. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
And I know we're going to talk about your new book, but for context, this is not your first book. So how long ago was it that you released a book that should be on everybody's shelf right now?
Data-Driven Nonprofits was my last book that came out in 2016, so 10 years ago. A lot of it still holds up, even in this day of analytics and artificial intelligence. And sort of the seeds for the new book actually came during the research and writing of Data-Driven Nonprofits. So I feel like things are coming a bit full circle.
How is that? What were the seeds that were planted back then?
So when I was doing some of the research for Data-Driven Nonprofits, I was really trying to understand some of the historical roots of fundraising. Why do we do things the way we do them? And at the time, a lot of it was, why isn't data a bigger part? And so what it led me to is getting a bit of a historical understanding of two fundraising pioneers that listeners may have never heard of, but we live with their innovation even today. And that's Charles Ward and Lyman Pierce. So these were early fundraisers back in the early 1900s. They started out doing fundraising work with the YMCA, but over the course of their careers spanning 30 plus years, they worked with the Red Cross, the Boys and Girl Scouts, the Salvation Army, and they traveled the world essentially spreading their strategy and principles and fundamentals around fundraising. And later in his life, Lyman Pierce, as what happens with many fundraisers, started a consulting business on the West Coast. And in 1932, he wrote a book called How to Raise Money. And I got a hold of two rare copies of the book. It's out of print. You can't really find it just about anywhere. And, but it's a hard read, right? It's written in the parlance and language of the 1920s, 1930s. And I'd always had the idea of, this be a really interesting book to maybe republish, except for the fact that it was a tough read, right? It is not, the principles and the fundamentals translate really well to the modern day and age we live in, but the prose doesn't. And so it sat on the shelf for years. Maybe I'll get to that. I'm not going to write another book. Maybe I'll get to that. I'm not going to write another book. And then eventually I decided, if I'm going to do this, now's the time. And so what I did was essentially completely rewrite, rework, restructure the original How to Raise Money from 1932, but writing it for the modern fundraiser. So extracting out from what Pierce learned from proven fundamentals that now have sort of stood the test of time of over 100 years. But for me, it was putting that in a context that today's fundraiser could understand, appreciate, but also put into practice. And so the last book turned into the current new book, I guess. Yeah.
There's a lot underneath that story too. But one thing to touch on first for people who, like me, were not familiar with Lyman Pierce, is that it wasn't just that they had a strong fundraising record, that they raised, I think you said in the frontispiece, $350 million at that time, which would be in the billions today, obviously.
Yeah. So in their, over the course of, let's say 30 years, they raised about $350 million for charities around the globe, which would be over $5 billion in today's money. And they did this, Jay, with index cards and telegrams and posters and boards. There were no CRM systems. There were no donor management tools. There was no analytics. I mean, it was as no tech, low tech as you could get. And so the fundamentals had to work. The fundamentals had to work because they were not going to be able to skate by on just having the machines do the work for them.
They also were, at least at the time he wrote the book, it was 1932. So they passed through a pretty turbulent time. Not just domestically, but as you said, these were international concepts, internationally practiced. So they went through a period between, I guess, post World War I through immediate aftermath of the crash of the stock market at the time he wrote this book. So I guess the principles aren't just principles for a time when we're flush, but also times when maybe things are challenging.
Oh, absolutely. A tremendous amount of social, political, global upheaval on, like the times we probably live in today, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right.
But they were doing that. And it's funny, as I more learned about Lyman Pierce, one of the things I found was interesting. I mean, he literally traveled the globe to like Australia and the UK and other places, but not on planes, but by a boat to Australia. I uncovered in President Teddy Roosevelt's archives, there are letters that Roosevelt writes to Lyman Pierce congratulating him on the work that he's doing overseas and how it's benefiting. Wow. Like really fascinating, but time has forgotten him for the most part and this book. But what I found digging into the book and the whole act of sort of historical, restoration of it was just how spot on the fundamental core principles that he really found and validated through his work still hold up today, even though it's 100 years later.
There's a lot I'd love to talk about in this, but I do want to get right into that. So yeah. You can't take us through the whole book. There's a lot in here. I mean, the chapter by chapter part is pretty astounding. But what are some of the core elements that you cover here that were key for him, but also you think are particularly relevant now for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, in the book, he talks about how do you structure a successful campaign, and then how do you move from fundraising in a campaign to sort of ongoing development. So the idea that fundraising is a permanent discipline, not just some periodic event. I think that holds up today. And there's some core principles, but there's a couple that I think really resonate and hold up well today. And one of them that he talks about over and over again is the importance of competent leadership. That you may have the right tools, the right technology, the right ideas, but without competent leadership, right? That the organization has clear leadership that not only knows how to lead the organization, but is involved, and that fundraising is a core part of what leaders do, even though they may have other responsibilities. But that is a core part of what they're doing, and that leader has to be competent at not only driving the mission of the organization, but that the practice of fundraising is a core part of what they do, and that they have the skills and the techniques and the know-how in order to do that. And I think that's really key. Another thing he talks about is the notion of, timeliness in a campaign and a balanced scale of giving. And those concepts hold up well today, that the idea of you can't rush into a fund, you've got to plan this out. You can't rush it through, that you've got to plan things out. Things happen in a particular order with a campaign, that the idea of a gift table, which still exists today, these guys invented it back in the early 1900s. The concept still holds out even more so today as you're thinking about, I've got an annual giving program. I might have a mid-level program, a major gift program. I've got campaign giving. I've got to have that balanced scale of giving, which is a concept that he talked a lot about and sort of is incorporated in the book as well, is you've got to have that to be successful. Absolutely.
Is there anything that you encountered in looking was dated, not just the prose, but some of the concepts, anything that doesn't translate?
There were a couple things that don't translate, but some of them have to do with particular giving instruments. So he had some particular perspectives about annuities, giving through life insurance, and some other things that like didn't really pan out through the Great Depression, the stock market crash. But there are some things he didn't quite get right, but most of it holds up remarkably well in terms of where to focus, the balance in an overall fundraising program, timeliness, accountability, that we hold people accountable for the metrics and the results that we're trying to do. All that holds up really, really well today. He didn't have anything about AI or crypto, but but I think you would still apply the same principles to the new tech anyhow, right?
Right. No, absolutely. Well, in fact, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about what you said about leadership. So the concept of leadership, maybe that has shifted, or is the definition the same? Because when you just talked about those letters from Roosevelt to Pierce, I was thinking those are both leaders, but leaders in different fields. Would we necessarily see a top fundraiser as a leader today? Maybe we should, but would everybody define it that way? So how was Pierce defining leadership, and maybe how might you define it? And do you think that's changed at all? And maybe something we need to consider as we undertake big fundraising campaigns, not just for the money, but for what they advance in terms of ideas.
I think Pierce's idea, and what I've tried to stay true to in the book, is that that leaders exist at all levels of the organization. And so it's not just the CEO or the executive director or the chief philanthropy officer, the chief development officer, but in fact, there are leaders at all levels. And some of those leaders have a title that sounds like it's a leader title, but others are just leaders in the work that they do. And so what he really reinforced as a core principle, and I believe is still true today, right, is that you can have leaders at all levels of the organizations, that they are oftentimes the big variable of which everything else depends on. That the success of your fundraising programs and your efforts is about who are the leaders in the organization and how do they help contribute in terms of culture, behavior, best practices, all of those kinds of things, as opposed to not being successful. And I think I think that there's a linkage to leadership and the use of a lot of these timeless principles that's so important. Jay, I could, tell you that the organization with the greatest technology but weak fundamentals will always underperform a mediocre organization with modest tools but has a disciplined approach. And I've worked in technology for 25 plus years, so I feel like I can say this, which is we sometimes want to put technology in front of strategy, but strategy comes before technology in the dictionary, and that's generally how it should work as well. That if you've got these core fundamental principles and you tie that to the tools, you can outperform organizations who maybe just have the tools but don't have the principles, don't have the leadership capabilities, because at the end of the day, the human element in fundraising still makes a critical difference, if not the difference, even though we've got more tech than we ever had before.
You haven't just been in fundraising tech for 25 years. You've been in this field for 25 years. This field is social good, call it what you will.
Yeah.
And so you've seen both what works and what doesn't, but you've also seen the impact personally, and I'm sure you have as a donor, as well as a consultant and a product guy, many things, many hats you've worn. Is there something, though, that you learned maybe that you didn't anticipate learning by doing this project, by looking at this guy's work from 100 years ago and then saying, oh, yes, either reminding yourself of a truism or maybe learning something new for the first time?
There was definitely moments of discovery, and then also just being reminded of things that, we maybe just take for granted or assume are true. Lyman Pierce was a data-driven fundraiser. He just didn't have the technological marvels that we have today, but he believed in metrics and accountability and that there are systematic approaches that you can take. And at the same time, he was also a big believer that you have to have a compelling cause, and you've got to be able to communicate to that compelling cause about things. And I think there were also things that he reminded me of. We always like to believe that the world we're living in today is so unique to ourselves and that no one had all of these things. But as you pointed out before, like what happened before, during, and after World War I, what happened before, during, and after the Great Depression, a lot of those trends still echo. He lived through experiences before, during, and after World War I, before, during, and after the Great Depression. But I think it gives us some modern context for the change that we deal with today. I mean, Pierce takes on very early in his book, and some content I tried to modernize, which is the United States is the wealthiest nation in the world, and yet what do we do with that giving? And those are questions we're still asking ourselves today. Recently, past couple of days, there was an article in the New York Times about the Giving Pledge, and now that's come up again. I am sure that this debate raged back in Pierce's time when we were talking about Carnegie and Rockefeller, not Gates and Elon Musk and everyone else. So it is interesting how some of these core fundamentals just transcend time, but they're discussions we should have within the industry, across the sector, as leaders, as fundraisers, as people are trying to help. Yeah.
The last question, which is to do with more of the personal side of this. So you talked about picking up the book, finding an interest in it, because you tend to dig into things. And that's one of the reasons why this book is going to be so interesting for the rest of us, because you've spent the time and you're bringing it to all of us. So we appreciate that. But there's a reference in the beginning of the book to your great-grandmother Pierce.
Yeah.
Is there also a family connection, or is that just a wild coincidence?
So this was probably the real reason why I had to do this book and just couldn't let it sit on the shelf. So when I did the early research and I was learning about Lyman Pierce, I found he was born in 1868 in Stockton, New York. Now, that doesn't mean much to a whole lot of people, but it does to me because my mother grew up in Stockton, New York. My grandparents grew up in Stockton, New York. And my great-grandmother had an antique shop in a big old house in Stockton, New York. So there's a personal connection to Pierce because Stockton, New York is a one stoplight town in Western New York. It was more than just coincidence. So I wanted to learn more about him and what he was doing because there was a personal connection as well, which is, fascinating to me and hopefully interesting to readers too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this, Steve. How can people get a copy of the book?
Wherever books are sold, although in a lot of cases that's Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, et cetera, but anywhere you buy your books today, you should be able to find a copy of How to Raise Money.
Great. Thank you so much for this. Appreciate it. My thanks again to all three of our guests today. One correction from earlier in the program, that $50 million gift that I mentioned to the University of Chicago was not, in fact, anonymous. That was an error on my part, but it was made by Rika and Joe Mansueto, and that will serve to advance research and support faculty work in artificial intelligence. Now, coming up next in the Philanthropy Mastermind series, on a recent episode of the PM podcast, I spoke with Kate Sheeran, Joan and Martin Messenger, Dean of the Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester. We explored her journey from professional musician to leading one of the world's great conservatories and the moments that shaped her path, including the choice between a jean jacket and a French horn. You'll have to listen to understand that reference, but it's pretty funny. And coming up this Friday on the PM podcast, I'll be joined by Karen Isbell, Vice President for College Advancement at Kalamazoo College and Chair of the Board of Directors of the Kalamazoo Symphony Orchestra. We'll talk about her leadership journey from the stage to playing a leading role in staging some of the most successful higher education campaigns in the country. And next Wednesday on How to Raise, we'll present Reaching Out to the Business Next Door, a relationship-driven approach to corporate philanthropy, part of course, our CFRE accredited series. Presenter Sarah Miller of Palmetto Philanthropy will take us on a practical tour of how corporate giving works today how decisions are made, how priorities are shifting, and how you can build a pipeline of corporate partners using relationship-driven strategies that you can put into practice right now. You can learn about all these programs through our friends at Evertrue and DonorSearch, the generous sponsors of the Philanthropy Mastermind series, now in its 11th year at DonorSearch.net. I'm Jay Frost. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care.